My name is Kathryn Soltis. I'm honored to help out on the executive committee of the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. And I'm pleased to be able to join you all today. I'm joined particularly by two co-facilitators who are also on the executive committee of CPMC. And I want to introduce them to you now. And I should say myself, Kathryn Soltis. I am over here outside of Philadelphia. I run the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University and have been engaged in prison ministry for about 20 years or so. And so I just wanted to introduce you to my co-facilitators who I have the privilege of working with and learning from. Father Dustinfeddon is a priest in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, and the executive director of Joseph House, which is a nonprofit ministry designed to support the complete restoration and full reintegration of formerly incarcerated individuals into local communities and neighborhoods. And Father Fedden holds a PhD from Florida State University's Department of Religion and teaches philosophy at St. John Vianney College Seminary in their online program. So we're really excited to have you join us for this conversation, Father Dustin. And I am also joined today by Dr. Kimberly Lymore, who is a preacher, professor, retreat and workshop facilitator. In 2000, she left corporate America for full-time ministry as the pastoral associate at the faith community of St. Sabina, which is known for its social justice activism. Dr. Lymore is also the director of the Augustus Tolton Pastoral Ministry Program at Catholic Theological Union and the associate convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. Dr. Lymore received her Master of Divinity from CTU and her Doctor of Ministry from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. So vast experience and knowledge and wisdom, and we have that in the full room here. So very excited to be able to see all your faces and to have this moment of conversation. Today's town hall is Confronting and Healing Ministerial Witness to Racism. And our real goal here today is to think about some of our recent programming and have the chance to process it, engage it, further the conversation. There have been, over the last couple of months, 3 different programs that we think are of particular interest to us in our conversation today. On January 13th, we had a webinar with Dr. Christopher Pramick, Addressing Racism, A Time for Gospel Courage. And then on February 4th, there was a town hall with Gloria Purvis, and also Father Dustin was in that conversation. That was about addressing racism, gospel witness. And then more recently on February 18th, we had a webinar with Father Reagan Shriver, which discussed trauma-informed care and included conversation of racial trauma in that. There were 3 wonderful presentations. We were really very, very grateful to have that wisdom and the contributions of those folks who are on those recordings. The webinars are available on the website if you were not able to view them. But we wanted to take this moment to think about what we heard, and particularly Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition is doing some strategic planning right now, and we really want to have the input of those who are doing this work and processing the questions of race and racial justice and racial trauma in the trenches, in this ministry, to know how to move forward and know what kind of needs there are, know what kind of opportunities there are. So with that in mind, I want to begin by asking Father Dustin and Dr. Lymore to help us sort of recall some key ideas. And so I just wanted to ask each of you if you could share, one or more key takeaways from any of those 3 programs that you think would be important, especially important ideas for the concrete realities encountered by those who minister to those impacted by incarceration, bringing it to the context of the ministries relevant for CPMC. So I'm not sure who wants to start. How does the Spirit move you? Father Dustin, do you want to go first?
Sure. It's like, whenever I go to dinners, I'm always the one having to bless the food. I always tell people you can bless food too, you lay people. Anyways, yeah, there was, we were just talking before, Kathryn, about it. There was so much content, and I'm thinking of Chris's presentation in particular. I mean, it felt like it was a retreat in a lot of ways, and very, the spiritual dimensions of 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 the need of addressing racism in the church. And then I've been one of the things that has stuck with me, from the different presentations, was Gloria's very personal witness of her experience of racism in the church. And I think of all the different types of ministries and ways of addressing racism in society and in our culture. But I think that if we don't first address it within the church and in parish structures and in Catholic schools and universities and grade schools, especially grade schools, where I've heard, I mean, as a priest, I've heard racist comments, xenophobic comments coming from children in the playground, when I was in Pensacola, actually. And it was shocking. And I know that these kids are hearing it. They're not just coming up with this by themselves. They're hearing it from their parents. And then certainly in my own, one-on-one conversations with parishioners and acknowledging their and what they oftentimes will identify as their struggle with racism, and trying to kind of get to the root of where this is coming from. But so I say that to say that, when Gloria spoke about the effect of not feeling as though you belong, that has stayed with me, and it's to say that it's to speak of the effects of feeling it in places where you should feel that you belong, especially in the church, right? And that sense of being welcomed, of being cared for, of being respected. And if she spoke of various different instances of feeling as though not belonging, and that what that, I guess the reason that has kind of stuck with me is because that seems to me to be at the very core of what it means to be a church of that appreciates, that respects, that acknowledges human dignity within the personal kind of realms. And in what ways do we, maybe even unconsciously as a church, with walls plastered with white saints, with white popes, with literature that speaks of white experiences, are we signaling a kind of exclusion, of a sense of not belonging? And I think of, especially in parishes that I've served that are multi-ethnic, and yet it's very clear that the spirituality, the music, the art kind of reflects one particular demographic of that parish. And so I guess, I know we're here thinking about prison ministry, but to me, it seemed, and what Gloria spoke to was the importance of, well, we first need to be able to address it within our own parishes and in our own communities, in order to be more effective, perhaps in doing it in outreach. So that sense of not belonging and her experiencing that within Catholic communities has kind of stuck with me. So.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I think it speaks to the fact that also what's at stake in our ministries, right? Because if our ministries are the place where belonging is either going to be offered or or compromised, right? The kind of trauma and the kind of damage that can be done, because it is the place, we ought to be the ultimate place of hospitality and welcome, right? So I think that really speaks to so much of why we need to be in this conversation and continuing it. So thank you, that's wonderful. Dr. Lymore.
And just to kind of piggyback on what Father Dustin was saying, I just so enjoyed that dialogue that he and Gloria had. It was, I could resonate with everything that she said, with, feeling like you don't belong and so forth in the church. But also, I think what happens when the conversation about racism comes up, they want the Black person to come and talk to the white people about racism, and it's really not our issue. We deal with it each and every day, but it's white people that need to talk to white people about racism, and to be able to honestly talk about it and confront their biases, and to look within to really reflect on ways that either consciously or unconsciously, they have these biases and these thoughts about the other, being either Black, Hispanics, or whatever, that kind of judge or color their thoughts about us or their interactions with us. And so I'd like to say her conversation was so on point. Not only did she confront it in church, but she confronted it in corporate America, where she talked about that job interview where she's highly educated and someone asked her, "Can you read?" Well, I don't know if I would have been as generous with my response as she was, but it's so obvious. I mean, she did not get to the level of education. Excuse me. The level of education that she attained without being able to read. I mean, it was such a really insensitive and very stupid question. But sometimes that happens where people have these biases and these low expectations of people of color, that in the interactions it comes through. So I thought that was a very good conversation and a good point, where white people need to confront each other or talk about it with each other in order to, and it might be easier. We were doing a seminar yesterday on sharing our stories. And sometimes it's just getting together and sharing stories and being honest about times where they did act racist, and ways in which they can turn those behaviors around. But unfortunately, racism is very much alive in our society. And if we did not see it, we saw it on January 6th at the Capitol. And so it was the epitome of what we say is white privilege, where they went into the Capitol, stormed the Capitol, and if it had been a Black Lives Matter movement, it would have been a different outcome. I'm sure of it. And so that racism that kind of after the civil rights movement had become a little more covert has become more overt right now. And so whereas some people are more sensitive and aware, and some things have happened since the George Floyd incident, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much. I think so much of what you said is really helpful in terms of, again, remembering, there's no one who isn't called to be part of this conversation. That's a double negative, which I apologize for. But right, I mean, and in particular, it is not the people who are victimized by racism who need to be doing the most work right now, right? It's those who are contributing to the system. And I mean, you're helping us, I think, in many ways, Dr. Lymore, by thinking about, right, the covert and the overt aspects. And we can't think about this without having both, and that's one thing that wondering if the two of you can maybe help us think through, there are lots of examples of individual incidents, personal behavior and bias, and those need to be confronted, examined, self-examined, right? But there's also the systemic characteristic of racism that we're talking about too, in ways that it is less visible, perhaps, but potentially more insidious. And so wondering, how you see this systemic nature of racism manifested concretely, right, in the prison and the criminal justice system. How is it made real in the types of situations that we're talking about in our Catholic prison ministries work? So either one of you are welcome to start. Dr. Lymore, you want to?
I think, when we look at who the prison population is, Black, Brown, that goes to show that there is a system of racism that where more Black and Brown people are arrested or put into the prison system than any other ethnic group. And so when you look at that, you look at the bail system that happens in the prisons, where, if you don't have enough money to post bail, then you sit there until you can. So there's just so many different aspects of that that's kind of inherent in there. When we talk about even, the dehumanization part, pulling away from, from the family. I did a seminar for Georgetown about a month ago, and it was on the women in the injustice system. And it was just so eye-opening for me because, a lot of times we just kind of focus, the men, and you see the men, women do go to jail, but, it's not as even in our ministries, there's not a lot of ministries that's dealing with that. We're trying to help the men out, but the women are the ones that are, when they're in their prison system, they're dehumanized. They usually have male wardens and jailer, or what do they call those folks that work in the jail, whatever. they have them, and they're mostly male, and so they have that whole sexism, racism, and all kind of things that happens in the prison system. But also just not having access to the things, feminine products and things that they need. And a lot of times I think I noticed a bias I had even was, you think that only, less educated, more poor people go to prison, but sometimes, you have some that come from two-parent families, and you get caught up in those systems, and so you end up going to prison if you do something wrong. And so, we have our own biases too when we encounter people that either, ex-convicts or have been in the justice system. And so as we look at, hopefully more legislation, and that's probably down the road in our conversation, hopefully in ways that we know that the prison system is unjust. And if you ever read the book, The New Jim Crow, and that, but, the thing is, we know this. So how can we make inroads into the changes that need to happen in the prison system, so that we are no longer, just talking about the racism part or the dehumanization part, but, what ways can we work out in that system itself to make it better, for lack of a better word, but more restorative than punitive.
Great, thank you. And I mean, you're helping us to remember that ultimately we do want to think today about, where do we need to go for CPMC and CPMC advocating for a larger society. So we do want to keep that in mind. Thank you. There's a lot there that you shared for us that we'll hopefully have more time to unpack. So let me turn to Father Dustin to see how you would respond to that same question.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the way that you began when you were phrasing the question, Kathryn, talking about systemic racism as something that maybe not visible, not as visible, but perhaps even more insidious or pervasive, kind of all around us. And I, this that was more or less kind of my experience, and going into the prison starting in 2013, and predominantly just going to the chapel. I would kind of move past the yard where there, you would see, I would see at least predominantly black and brown and white too, but predominantly black and brown men out in yard, and then I would kind of get shuttled over to the chapel, and our Catholic services were usually almost, well, I would say 80% white and 20%, Hispanic. So it wasn't as representative of the larger compound in these facilities. But when I started going to solitary confinement dorms, which in Florida, and I know in other southern states are, well, probably I can't imagine any solitary confinement dorm being, a particularly pleasing place to be, but particularly at least in Florida, it's awful. It's just, like, again, I know people have said it before, but most of us would not put our dogs in these cells. The noise, the stench, as someone described it, best, these cells are more like mop closets. And just imagine living there 24 hours a day. And in Florida, at any moment, we have 10,000 people, 10,000 inmates in solitary confinement. So right about this moment, we have about 10,000 inmates in solitary confinement. But it was when I was going into these dorms and realizing, I would say 80-85% were African-American men. And the majority young, in their 20s and early, in 30s. And to me, that was kind of like, something is wrong. That was to me the kind of the beginning of something that was invisible initially became visible. And it's just, it started dawning on me when I was going to these dorms and looking through these plexiglass windows, and 3 out of 4, or 3 out of 5 were Black faces that were sent to the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel of an already brutal system in Florida. They were occupying the most brutal spaces and cruel spaces in these systems. And so just the sheer kind of taking that in, the physicality of it, the physicality of these bodies being captive. And I'll never forget, and I'll kind of end with this, I'll never forget the moment when it kind of crystallized. For me, I had already, I had my introduction, Kimberly mentioned the new Jim Crow. I had my introduction in kind of literature on mass incarceration and the criminal justice system by reading Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And he really was the one that taught me, I would say, more than any other writer, that history matters. And it was reading that and I just started making these connections. Like, he didn't have to convince me, because I'd already seen what he was describing in, going to cell front daily. But then there was this moment when I looked up at one of the officers and their badge in Florida, the Department of Corrections, it says established in 1868. And when I saw that, I thought, well, this, there has to be a story here. Why 1868? And so I started doing a little bit of research and kind of, and discovered that Florida had this massive influx of freed men that they frankly were, one, scared of, didn't know what to do. And so they started creating, and I know most of us know the stories of the Black Codes and of, and then eventually Jim Crow laws, that vagrancy, homelessness, being indebted, all of these things meant that you would end up being sent to Florida's prisons. And so that's literally, historically, that's how the prison system in Florida was created. It was created because of all of these men that were now free. And that the state itself became, was scared of having them walking around city centers. So you create these laws to make them go away. And I say that because, to me, I mean, as Catholics, we believe that redemption is being played out in our moment and in our time. That redemption is interlinked with justice, and that the realities of salvation are not just for some remote afterlife, but are being played out before us. And to me, that was a sense of just making that one brief little historical connection, realizing that this is that these bodies that I'm seeing in these cells, that there are systemic issues in our criminal justice system, and that system has a history. And for me, that it gave me much greater context. And I have to be kind of, I guess, careful saying this. It gave me a greater kind of appreciation, and I would even say a kind of reverence for this work. That this work and attending to the issues and the realities of racism and the historical dimensions of racism is interlinked and with the very works of justice and of salvation for the church.
Thank you so much. That is so powerful. And I think this is exactly right, that we have to realize that, and we're being invited and called to realize that this ministry is never about just simply individual stories of harm, mistakes, and people. That this is about a social narrative of who we have said has belonged and who has not, right? This is about a history of marginalization, right? I mean, exploitation, ownership of human beings, right? I mean, a very painful, cruel history that we are, in the midst of. And when we have a society that clearly has groups of people that get marginalized by the way this society works, right? The prison is ultimately the place where you see that marginalization, get embodied, right? That it is not just stories of individual mishaps. It is about also the embodiment of the ultimate sort of logical conclusion of marginalization in our society, right? And I think that the picture you paint of going to the solitary confinement, right, that no one is getting sentenced to solitary. Those are decisions that are being made within those facilities, and they are, even while those facilities disproportionately, confine people of color, right? Those populations are still being even further disproportionately represented in the most harshest places, and so I think it is a great challenge. And also, as you say, like, there's something sacred about the work that we do when we're in this context. How do we become responsive to and responsible for being given entry into seeing these places and these human stories? And what is our call here? So with that, I want to, try to open this conversation up. I mean, the two of you have given us some really excellent pieces to begin, and we continue to go back and forth. But I want to hear from the rest of you on this call, those who would like to share, thinking about what you've just heard, or also the webinars, town halls. What has stuck with you? what are some of the pieces that you have taken that feel really significant to the work that you are doing, the ministries that you are doing, that you'd like to lift up for us? So, maybe if we could take a few moments to just hear from a few of you, that would help our conversation, the discernment of the dialogue here.
I'll bring something up if that's okay.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Bill. Yeah.
I don't have to do all the blessings at first when we get together for meals. I've got my grandkids I try to make do that. But yeah, something happened. I go to prison here in Ohio. It's a medium security prison, so we have people there who will never get out. We have a number who've been on death row. Now they're in for life. We have some who are only in there for 25 years. And it's interesting to hear how all that comes about. But one of the things happened in one of my classes, I'm trying to understand why and what made the change. We were having a class and we were discussing a book we were going through, I think one of Matthew Kelly's books. And one side of the room, there's this fellow. When he introduced himself to me, he said, I'm a former white supremacist. And he was sitting on one side, he's in for murder. On the other side of the room was a fellow who was a former black gang member. He was on death row. He had shot a young child off of a porch. So I've got these two fellows who just completely opposite of each other. And during the course of that day, the white supremacist said, I'm not really too worried about anything because I know when I die, I'm going straight to hell. There's nothing going to happen for me. And this other fellow sort of reached his hand over, in my mind anyways, and he said, no, you got that wrong, Red. He said, that's why Jesus died for us. He said, so that you don't have to do that. And it was amazing to me how those two folks from two really different, backgrounds reached out. The one who really reached out and to somebody who on the outside you would have thought they were complete enemies and never done that. And I don't know how that happened or why that happened. I don't know if it's because they were both at the very, as Dustin said, the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel, that they could relate to each other. But I found that pretty incredible to see that breakdown, because I would have thought of all places to see that type of racism, I would have seen it there. So that one was a surprise to me, a wonderful surprise, but I'm just trying to understand what may have brought that about.
I just want to kind of respond. When you were talking about that story, it just reminded me about, Good Friday. We had the two thieves on the cross, and, one, was, definitely, going against the negative about Jesus, and yeah, we all should die, blah, blah, blah. And then the other one was like, well, yeah, we deserve it, but Jesus doesn't. But, the thing is, just coming to that realization that, Jesus is the one, and God is the one who redeems us. And so obviously that was just one of those, I guess, Kairos moments where, one was reaching out to the other, and who knows what that trajectory took them from there. But, it was just, that was a powerful story you shared. So thank you, Bill.
I wish I could have taken that mixture and put it in a bottle and shared it with a lot of people.
Thank you so much. That's really a powerful story. We'll have to keep that in the mix here. Rosa, did I see your hand up? Did you want to? You're muted right now. I can't hear you from you.
Okay. Thank you for giving me this time. This is all very, very interesting to me. As maybe some of you know, I am presently a chaplain at the Women's Institution that houses women on death row. And previously I was a chaplain for a male institution. And so I've seen a lot of what some of you are describing, and all the challenges and so forth. At the same time, it seems to me that the whole reality of racism and what's happening in the prisons has a lot to, it's a much more complex reality, if you wish, because I think what I see is that incarceration is so connected with poverty. And so, in fact, as some of you mentioned, not being able to have a good lawyer, but also how poverty sometimes leads to crime, just for survival. And that's one issue that I think, we sometimes we kind of compartmentalize, but I think it needs to be connected to. And another issue is how we deal here in the US with mental health. There are so many people who are suffering from mental health that in prisons. They are the biggest mental health hospitals in the country, if you wish. And so I see sometimes the challenges that custody people face because the whole reality is very complex, and that sometimes, I'm not trying to defend discrimination and the cruelty that's happening, for sure. And I'm trying to do the best I can to kind of make custody be more aware of issues and even give literature and see, kind of make a little more connection between both. And many people do try to be more understanding and try to put themselves in other people's shoes. But the reality sometimes is so complex and the problems are so huge that sometimes oftentimes very little progress is happening. I just wanted to kind of broaden the subject, which is very real. I mean, racism is very real. And for me, actually, when I participated at the last few town halls, something that I took away with me that it was very important is the connection between racism and trauma. That it kind of opened my eyes a lot more, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you so much, Rosa. And I really appreciate you lifting up the ideas of, the connections here between poverty, mental health. I mean, this is a tangle, this is a web of issues, and it's really hard to try to treat things in compartments because they're so interconnected. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you. Does anyone else want to mention any other topics that they heard that they want to lift up from our conversation here today, or the webinars or town halls?
One of the things I would like to, talk about is that institutional racism. And it is, I'm in Texas, okay? So this is a state that's got a very long history of racial issues going back to even the time before we were a state of the Union. And it's like the institution is so set in its ways, but the society in general is that institution. It's hard to separate what the state is doing subtly in the criminal justice system, but it's also that same thing that's going on in the society as a whole. So it's not just one change, it's got to be a very broad kind of change. And it's hard to really get to break into that. And the church, there was a mention of racism in the church, which is even more subtle. I am attached to a parish that is a very multicultural parish. We've got the core of the original people who founded the parish, those who are still alive, and their sons and daughters have raised their families and they're still a part of the parish, and they're that one really solid core, almost impenetrable. But then we've got the African groups, we've got the groups from India, from all over the Pacific Islanders. And that core group is surrounded and intermixed with all of these other cultures, but they maintain that separateness. And I don't know, it's like one of those things that how do you begin to break into that deeper acceptance of other races and other cultures, that it's like almost an impenetrable problem. So.
You say it well, if I may just jump in here real quick, Kathryn. You say it so well, Larry. And as you were saying that, I was just thinking, because as you said, there's something about society. There's something about our society, the way in which our society operates, that seems to be still very much kind of not creating the conditions, but kind of continuing to pass this kind of very sinister kind of tradition, but as you were talking, and I was thinking of like, I know it in my family, I know it in families that I serve, so many of our families have been marked by, by one person, one member or two members being pegged as kind of the troubled children or the troubled uncle or and this kind of history of these rivalries, and that can make, and I'm not saying this to be humorous, but they can make Christmases miserable, that can make Thanksgivings miserable. The history of those relationships being unaddressed creates these tensions and the neglect and the abuse, and it continues kind of reinforcing early, initial traumas or violence or things that were said and betrayals and all of the rest. And I think of Cain and Abel, and I think of how the wealth of our scripture and our tradition in addressing, has already spoken to this, but we in our, in our society, even though we speak of it in one way, do we really allow these conversations to happen? And in the church, certainly, do we allow these conversations to happen, the stories to be told? And I'm not, because I think about it at family dinners, or I think about it at visiting with some, families in the community, like they will do everything to repress, to put, to not have those stories resurface, or the hatreds come to the surface. And I think that's a real challenge, of how to really foster that conversation and awareness of those ills that have been affecting our family.
Lucy.
Yes, remember the statement before that Ms. Lymore, I'm not sure how you say your name again, said that it's white people that need to be educated, that need to work on this issue of racism rather than the victims. And if anyone has the authority and the possibility to systemically get some change, because the church has been guilty of supporting racism in different ways. I'm a member of the Dismas Ministry Board, which is a part of this Catholic Prison Ministry group. And we've talked there about where's the USCCB on having some push, and this affects prison ministry, but it affects the whole society's level of being defensive about racism. We need education we need the promotion, the push by religion to get our country to look at the history that has brought us to this place. And, I think if this organization has any kind of place inside of the USCCB, there are places that are encouraging studies about the history of racism and the spirituality that in our lives can get us to see past the other as somebody who is different, and maybe help to break down the great divide that's in our country, of many divides, but certainly at the basis of it is racism, and how white privilege has been so in us that we're blind to it. I just wish that there were a way to systemically, through the church, get us to face our racism.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank
Okay.
Can I make just a comment? Thank you, Lucy, for that. But I would encourage people, we have a USCCB person, Marco, or that's on the committee. But let's not wait for the bishops, because back in 1979, they wrote What We Have Seen and Heard, and that was a letter about racism. And even a couple of years ago, they attempted to write another letter. I think it's Open Wide Our Hearts. But in reality, who reads those? And so I just encourage everyone to just really, if you have any kind of groups in your parishes or groups, other social groups that you're in, to just start the conversation. And don't wait for the church to act, because we are the church. And so don't wait for the bishops to act, because it might not happen. There's always these conversations about, the Pope will say something and then the bishops will do something else. And so let's be the church. Let's do what God has called us to do, and do what we can at the grassroots level, and prayerfully it'll trickle up, to where it needs to go, and things will start to happen.
Thank you. I know what you're talking about. We are the church, and where it's going to happen at the bottom. But I guess it just bugs me when the push is always about abortion and not about the people who are alive.
May I just say that I have nothing to add, except I want to put forward my gratitude, because I have felt the same way about the bishops, okay, and the same way about the church, how the church has dealt with this over the years. Thank you for bringing it up.
Let's get, Bob has a comment, and then I want to make sure that we give the time to the remaining time that we have, which is not too much, to thinking concretely about particularly CPMC's role in this work. So it's because some concrete ideas will really help us to move forward. So Bob, you had something you want to share?
Quickly build on Kimberly's comment. The bishops can say all they want, but what we found, I'm in a reentry ministry in Cincinnati, and we go out to parishes a lot, bringing generally African-American felons who've served time into white parishes who tell their story, and putting a face on the criminal justice system, on the racial imbalance with that. That's what works. It is extraordinarily gratifying to see how people react, because they don't know. There's no face. We hear from politicians, we hear from the media, and suddenly there's a real live human being who's trying to raise his or her family, telling their story, and it's incredible. The reverse of that, whether it's there or in a later mentoring relationship, is the returning citizen who says, my gosh, those white, middle or upper class people actually gave me the time to listen. So the bishop saying it would be great, but just to reinforce, it works on a one-to-one basis.
That's terrific, Bob. And I mean, I think we've heard that in different ways today about the power of stories and encounter, right? And real human beings in their lives and sharing that. So that's a really helpful reminder. And so I really, there's been so much that you have shared and helped us think through today. And so I want to make sure that before we run out of time, we really get to hear from you all about specific things that you think CPMC may be in a position to be doing, whether in terms of formation, in terms of advocacy, in terms of modeling certain initiatives, projects, because we can't wait for others to tell us what to do. So what is the call now for our coalition, which is filled with so many people doing this work right at the ground level? Larry, you had something?
Yes. Someone mentioned education. Education is a key to so much, but you have to want to get education to receive it. And one of the problems, like we talk about the bishop's writings or encyclicals from the Pope, or all of these, and those are written in church language, okay? And we hear all of this stuff from academics, and the academic stuff is written in academic language. We have very little in a common, understandable, concise, clear language that's written and able to be disseminated to inmates. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but I know that there are probably some really great writers in this group right here that could talk about the experience of not so much racism, but accepting others, being open and being able or being willing to be converted by what others have to give. So that's one thought.
Thank you, Larry. This is Harry Dudley. One thing that I would say is we really need to find more opportunities through the town halls, for example, to get those who have experienced the power of having someone listen to them to tell their story. So those returning citizens, both who are now doing this work and the returning citizens who still really need the story to be told, because I think it's getting those opportunities to hear those stories that kind of opens up people to realize there's so much more to this than we thought, and they now know them as a person as opposed to someone they fear. That's just what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Harry and Larry. What in terms of you're talking about materials that can be accessible and then making the voice accessible of those who are most directly touched by incarceration. But I'm also wondering about those who are ministering in these places. What do you, as people who are ministering, what kind of formation do you think that we ourselves, our peers need? What would that look like?
Yeah, I think if it's okay that we have to be able to reach out to younger people. As I take a look at the pictures here, the phases here, most of us are past 20 and 30. And that's one of the things that we're struggling with right now in our diocese is how do we recruit people, especially this last year with the pandemic. But until we get younger people involved to understand that, because there's a different language that they speak. And whether it be in poetry or in writing or whatever, we just hosted a writing festival here, and it was interesting to hear some of the poetry and stuff that came out of that from the young people, because it's a language that they speak. And I've seen some of the poetry written by some of the inmates, and it's very powerful. So it's, I guess my point is in terms of education, in terms of communication, what's the audience? If the audience is all of us over 50 to 60 to 70 to 80, then that's one thing. We miss out everybody who's coming up. So I think we have to somehow get that coming in. And I think that one way to do that is we have to have some of the writing, some of the poetry, some of the songs that come from those incarcerated or not incarcerated, but who've lived through some of this, the racism. I think back to the poem on January 20th, the inauguration, and everybody said how much that struck them. So again, you know, who's the audience and how can we speak to them?
That's beautiful. Thank you. I think again, like this language, you know, how can we be heard? It's a really important reminder. And I was thinking about Amanda Gorman too, as you were talking. It's wonderful. Emily, you have something.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm from Chicago. I work for Colby House Jail Ministry. One thought that I have is, you know, allowing our prison ministry agencies, whether if that's a group of volunteers or if it's a department in your diocese, but to really become models of grappling with questions of racial justice and having conversations about how do we become anti-racist in our individual lives, in our office culture, in the way that we make decisions as a group. Just kind of grappling with the real depth of racism that exists in our society, and being models, you know, and letting that kind of trickle out into the rest of our archdiocese and to parishes that we work with. And that will show through in our ministry as well. So that's one thought that I'd love to see happen, I know, for us, and, you know, something that maybe support from an organizational level for CPMC would be helpful for local groups.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Emily. This conversation about how to be anti-racist in our ministries and our parishes and every place is, I think, a really fruitful one. Wonderful. Karen and then Chandra.
I just have a quick question. I'd love to hear from the group as far as, you know, I love this. There's a whole area that we could discuss about being anti-racist and addressing the whole issue that people think they're colorblind. You know, there's a lot of other facets, but I wanted just to make sure or hear from this group that we haven't beaten this to death. I mean, are you tired of hearing about it, or is this, we don't want to leave the topic too soon, but we don't want to lose people to engage, or if there's other issues that we need to be addressing. But this is, you know, I think the trauma and the racism were such underlying problems within incarceration and detention that we just need to keep it up forward. But I'd love to get the wisdom of the group before we sign off. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I know Chandra had something before you spoke, but then I think we'll go back to your question, make sure we hear that. Chandra?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I could say well, of course, those of us who are here today probably aren't the ones who think that we're beating a dead horse. So and I'm certainly among those. It feels like we're just beginning to have the conversations that we so need to have. And one of the things that I hope that we as a coalition could explore and maybe provide training in is some of the restorative justice practices. And like in particular, I know I'm signed up to do a training for circles. It just feels like the being able to tell stories, getting practice telling stories, helping other people be able to tell stories, bringing those practices into the facilities that we visit is part of bringing the stories out of the facilities to share with others as well. So that's I think one area that we as a coalition could very fruitfully continue to explore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and so more comments maybe here on whether or not we have exhausted or perhaps need to, you know, how much more is Karen's question, right? Bob, did you have something on that?
I had another thought, but let me not interrupt if you want to continue that thing. All right, I'll go ahead. So in terms of what I think would help, as I said, we're a reentry ministry. The whole area of trauma and trauma care is so deep and we don't understand it. I see behaviors that just make no sense coming from where I'm coming from, but I've never been in prison, I've never been in poverty, and I've never been Black. And the more I learn about that, it helps me and mentors who are working with our members begin to understand, which is the beginning, and then practical ways we can minister to people who've been traumatized and try to help them shape their behaviors. Just a 30-second, and I wasn't intending this, someone asked about telling stories. As it turns out, we have an annual breakfast that's a fundraiser that's virtual, and it's 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. If any of you want to see some of the storytelling we do, I'll throw the link up in the chat. You can sign up. We won't ask you for money, but we'll have we have one recorded and 2 of our live returning citizens who will tell their story, plus we'll tell the story of the program and talk briefly about criminal justice. So again, I wasn't intending that, but I heard some interest in it. If you want to, join us.
Fantastic. I'm glad that we triggered that. I'm glad that, so look in the chat, folks, for that link. That's wonderful. We're mostly out of time. Are there any other thoughts in terms of, especially in terms of what more CPMC should do as to provide resources? But I'm getting that the sense I'm getting is that that we're in the midst of momentum, and we certainly haven't come to the end of the conversations, and that we can find more ways to do this, more stories, more language, and more sharing and presence. It sounds like is called for here. But any closing words, Dr. Lymore or Father Dustin, that you wanted to share?
I think as we are closing and thinking about, this as, ministry, I mean, that's the word that kept coming up and we kept referring to. We are doing this ministry. There's a South African word, Sawubonani, and it's just simply, I see you. I value you. I trust you. And so I think if we just treat each other as the Imago Dei, that we see the God in each person, that this work won't be in vain. We just continue to do what we need to do, what God has called us to do, and we keep moving in that direction.
Every time you talk, I just want to say amen afterwards. So, amen. Amen.
Amen.
Father Dustin, did you have anything else?
No, honestly, I'll let Kimberly's words be my last words as well. So amen, Kimberly.
Amen. Thank you all for being here today. This was a great joy to be able to be in this conversation with so many of you. So grateful for your time.